But lastly, I do want to also thank another special group of people, and that is the sponsors for this conference and the entire educational series, because it truly cannot happen without their financial support. And really, the greatest value they're giving to us too is letting us know how much they know the importance of community and education are to make living with HD easier. So I'd like to take a moment to thank Neurocrine, Teva, Genentech, Unicure, PTC, Sage, Prolenia, and Annexon. And I'm thrilled that the list keeps growing, because that means there are that many more people who love and support the HD community and are fighting for it. So, yes. And now I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Benjamin Gilmer, who is a family physician and associate professor at the UNC School of Medicine and Mountain Area Health Education Center's Family Medicine Residency Program. I don't know how you get that all on a business card. He is an international Albert Schweitzer Fellow and attended Davidson College and then studied at the Sorbonne in Paris and then East Carolina University. His advocacy work is focusing on bringing media attention to the social injustice of mass incarceration. His current book, The Other Dr. Gilmer, and the feature film project both highlight the atrocity of mass incarceration of people with mental illness. Both projects are based on a 2013 This American Life podcast, which is called Dr. Gilmer and Mr. Hyde, which was a collaboration between Benjamin and Sarah Koenig and has had more than 20 million listeners. He is a former neurobiologist turned rural family doctor who has lectured widely about medical ethics, global and rural health, the intersection of medicine and social justice, and the pursuit of advocacy. He lives in Asheville with his wife Deirdre, their two children, Kai and Leah, and their dog, Prince Peanut Butter. So,
thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Most people are just interested in our dog. Everybody loves our dogs. Thank you, Debbie. Thanks for having me. This club of yours is one that, maybe a little feedback, that I've wanted to be a part for so long, and I've been sort of on the periphery over the last 10 years. So I'm really excited to be here with you all in our HD community in North Carolina. So I want a couple thanks, Debbie and Lauren. Is Lauren here? Where's Lauren? There you are, thank you. To all my HD mentors, Mary Edmondson, who couldn't be here, Daniel Clausen, who's at Vanderbilt, Francis Walker, who's gave me my first introduction to Huntington's 10 years ago. So today is we're gonna have a little story time. And could you cut me off at 10:45? Okay. Everybody can cut me off 10:45, so we can have a little conversation. And in the back, can everybody hear in the back? Okay, good. I have this walking disorder too. I can't stop moving, so I'm going to be pacing around throughout your community here. So today we're going to talk about advocacy a little bit and how story intersects with advocacy. This is nothing, I knew nothing of this 10 years ago until this really interesting and very bizarre story happened to me. So we're gonna practice, and I know you can't really see that in the back. Don't worry about it. So, why is it so important to share stories? What is the power of sharing stories? And you can just call it out. Connection. Yeah. Why is it so powerful that we communicate with story or in story? Memorable. It's interesting. Relatable. It's relatable. Tradition. You want to say more? Tradition was. So what does tradition confer when you talk about tradition? I used to be a high school teacher, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I feel you honing in. Just family values and morale and just community, things like that.
Yeah. A plus, A plus. Story enables us to talk in tradition and to convey values, and to do that very efficiently, much more efficiently than having a didactic communication. So this is like sort of the fundamentals of narrative medicine. So we think the doctors in family medicine, we tell lots of stories all day. We listen to stories, we tell stories, we communicate in story, and it's very powerful. I am obsessed with the brain. I used to be, in a previous life, I was a neurobiologist, and I studied neurotoxicity associated with the brain. So I'm kind of a geek about these things. But it turns out that everybody has two hemispheres of the brain, right? Anybody not have two hemispheres of the brain?
Some days.
Anybody know which hemisphere you live in most of the time? Are you a left brain person? Are you a right brain person? Your right brain? Yeah. How about the neurologist over here? Left brain? Yeah. So I think it's important when you think about story and when you think about advocacy, because when you tell a story to make change, you really have to figure out where the person is coming from that you're trying to convince, right? And story is deeply intersected with your right hemisphere of the brain. So the right hemisphere is your awareness, your creativity, your ability to see beyond the pragmatic checklist that we live by every single day. So it incorporates the things that are normally outside of our consciousness and makes them more meaningful. In pop psychology, we think about music, emotions, all those things, but story is deeply rooted in the right side of your brain. And I wish we could talk more about that. So when you like to tell stories to people, who do you share them with? Everybody. Everybody. Anyone in particular that you like to share stories with? Friends. Strangers. Jessica, thank you. Customers trying to sell that product. Family. Co-workers. Yeah, you can share a story with anybody, right? But it depends on the type of story you're trying to tell. So I tell stories with my patients every day, but you can tell stories to yourself. And I think that's really important too, the art of telling yourself a story, because if you're advocating for something like HD, which requires immense work and teamwork, you have to tell a lot of stories to get things done. Look at all these HD Reach people. They're doing so much. You have to tell stories with your peers. And then ultimately, you have to tell stories with the universe, right? With media, depending on what your advocacy mission is. And this is kind of what my story is a little bit about, is learning how to communicate with media to get something done. Like that's why I'm here. Because I've been trying to be a student of many things. One is Huntington's, but the other is trying to learn how to tell stories in a way that makes impact, that makes change. So I think we've shared a little bit of this already, but I think it's interesting, why must we share difficult stories? And telling a story of Huntington's is a difficult story. Living with Huntington's is a difficult story. But when you do tell the story, it transforms the message that you're trying to share, right? Because it makes people more curious. If I tell someone to take this hydrochlorothiazide for their blood pressure, that's not a very interesting story. And they may not take that medicine at all. But if you tell a story in a way that captures someone, then it builds on a curiosity and it inspires you to share. Now, we've already talked about tradition right here. Tradition engenders community. It's therapeutic, ultimately, like telling a story, both for the person who's telling the story and for the listener, oftentimes, is a very therapeutic process. And ultimately, it triggers the right side of your brain and creativity. Now, in family medicine, we practice listening all day long. And if you're a good listener, that means you can tell a story well, too. But this is really important when we think about like the difficulty of like telling a hard story. It's important to recognize that the process of doing it really can bridge differences of opinion in a very deeply profound way. I had the chance to tell a story to the North Carolina legislature this year because Secretary Kensley in the Department of Health and Human Services is really focused on enhancing behavioral health in North Carolina, like to the tune of $1 billion. And trying to tell that story and the importance of that story to a group of legislators that were really not interested in Medicaid expansion, super important in North Carolina, it's happening, but trying to yoke that story with a group of legislators that really didn't care so much about it. They were indifferent in many ways. So telling the story to the legislators was really fun because I got to experiment a little bit with rather than doing a straight up didactic, to share this common story of mental health. And that's what this story is about. It's about mental health. Anybody know what the story of self means? So the story of self is part of a framework that was originally proposed at Harvard, based in what's called kind of a relational leadership style of practice. And the story of self is a therapeutic way to tell your story, and to harness your story for other people. So the task for all of you today is to think about what your story of self may be. So that may be as an advocate, that may be as a patient, that may be as a family member, that may be as a community member. But think about what your personal elevator pitch is and how that story intertwines with the mission that you're pursuing. So I'm going to tell my little story of self. So my little story of self, so I'm a rural country doctor outside of Asheville, and I started my first job after residency. So in family medicine, you go to med school and then you do a residency. And the only job that was available for me in Asheville, the one that I really wanted, was a tiny little clinic outside of Asheville called Cane Creek. And that was the place that I thought that would be perfect for me. However, during my interview for the job, I was questioned about the other Dr. Gilmer. And I didn't really know who the other Dr. Gilmer was. I had heard something about him, but I didn't really know anything about him. And then they told me that my predecessor in that clinic had brutally killed his father in a grotesque way. And that he was serving life in prison in Virginia because of this act. And then I learned that we shared the same name. So it was a very bizarre way to start a career, walking in the footsteps of a presumed murderer with the same name, and then inheriting all of his patients. And what did the patients want to do? They wanted to tell stories about him. Why? Because he was a great doctor. They wanted me to be more like him because he was such an amazing, compassionate provider and human. For example, rather than just giving an antidepressant to his patients, several of his patients told me that he would take them on walks out behind the clinic. There's like a 200-acre field. He would take them on walks, and he would ask them to look for 4-leaf clovers. And he would just talk to them. A little bit unusual. I thought it was a little bit unusual. They told me that he gave all of his patients hugs. Every single one of them. Nobody left the building until they got a hug. And his nickname, as a result, was Bear. So his name was Vince, but everybody called him Bear because he gave hugs to everyone. I found that a little bit unusual. And then I heard a story from one of his professors in medical school that during rounds, where you have a team of doctors around, there was an intercom that was on the wall, paging Dr. So-and-so, paging Dr. So-and-so, and he quietly got up, walked over to the wall, lifted the intercom off the wall, cut the wires with a knife, put the intercom back on the wall, and then walked back to rounds and finished rounds. Nobody, people didn't think that was completely normal, but it wasn't that unusual for Vince. A lot of people described him as being a little bit on the quirky side of things. These were all little clues that I was starting to put together in my mind, because ultimately I wanted to know what happened to the other Dr. Gilmer. Why did this good man do this terrible deed? How could that have happened? His patients didn't understand it. They had no idea how this could have happened and were baffled after 10 years. And so I was baffled too. So I had this growing dissonance between who this man was, this good man, this amazing provider that my patients wanted me to emulate, and this person who committed this horrible crime and was serving life in prison. Thank you. Hug. So this was my dilemma. What do I do with this? And then I discovered one day that from a patient, that he was getting out of prison, and that I would be a likely target for him because I had stolen his life, because I had continued in the footsteps that he wanted to walk, and that I had stolen his patients, and I had stolen his clinic, and that, of course, he would want to come after me. So here is Vince in 2001. This was during the early days of his practice. And on July the 10th in 2003, he was going to take his board exams and had an accident and flipped his truck and hit a pole. And was transported to Mission Hospital as a trauma patient and couldn't remember his name. So this was like another clue. So I started seeing this collage of stories that was evolving about what happened to this man. Well, I thought I knew what happened to this man. Anybody have any guesses? TBI, traumatic brain injury. Why did I think he had, we're coming to that. Why did I think he had traumatic brain injury? We certainly had symptoms. He had symptoms, but my master's thesis was on traumatic brain injury. And so it was an easy bias that I linked to the accident. And it turns out that all of us, doctors in particular, are very biased. All of us have internal bias, and it's almost impossible to get rid of it. And this was my bias. I thought he had a traumatic brain injury. Immediately after the accident, he started having some emotional changes. He started having some cognitive changes. He started doing things that were not what he normally did. People thought he was going through a midlife crisis. Then he abruptly got a divorce with his wife that Christmas. And then things started to go downhill. So the same summer that the accident happened, I was placed in my first clinical rotation. When I went to med school, I wanted to be an emergency medicine doctor. I had planned my whole life around it. So I wanted my first rotation to be in the emergency department. But instead, I was thrown into a mental hospital. Anybody live in Morganton? Yep, so I was placed in Broughton Hospital, which is a mental hospital, psychiatric facility. And that summer, I took care of the adolescent ward, so a group of girls who were struggling with trauma, and it was my first exposure to what trauma really is, like to see it. I'm a privileged person from Charlotte, and I had never seen trauma before. It was so impactful to me. That summer in the afternoons, I would walk around the geriatric wards, and there was a patient that I met that I became a little curious about because we shared the same name. His name was Dalton Gilmer. And all I knew about him was that he had diagnosed schizophrenia. He had some cognitive deficits. He was confined to a wheelchair. And in the afternoons, I would go up and we would sometimes have talks. That's all I knew about Dalton Gilmer. That was 2003. In 2004, Dalton's son, Vince Gilmer, Bear, went to Broughton Hospital to pick him up. And when he did, he decided to take him to a lake to go canoeing for the afternoon before taking him to the skilled nursing facility, which was their ultimate destination. Some people thought that was strange, but what was really strange was that he went missing that night and was found the very next day in Washington County, Virginia, so in Southwest Virginia. Vince returned to the clinic and saw patients that whole week and described that his dad had gone missing, but was able to see patients for nearly the entire week. On that day, I was having my sort of baptism in medical school. I worked in Africa for a while, and this was at the Albert Schweitzer Hospital, and I was really learning more about medicine than I ever thought I would as a third-year medical student. But that was the day that Dalton Gilmer went missing, and he was found on Good Hope Road. And in 2009, I started my practice in Vince Gilmer's clinic. So Vince was convicted. He was tried in Virginia, and he did the wildest thing that you could ever imagine if you were having your own trial for murder. And that was, he fired all of his lawyers and represented himself and was floridly delusional during his trial. He was diagnosed as a malingerer. I think many of you know what that means. It means that you're faking symptoms. He was diagnosed as a malingerer, and the judge convicted him and described him to be nothing more than a cold-blooded killer. And so he went to prison, and that's where he is today. So this is really a question for all of you, because this group together collectively is about a story of us. And so a story of us is trying to convey the values, experiences, or aspirations like that we have together, to tell a common story together and appeal to others to join you. So what stories can you share to express these values? So think about that for a moment. Like, what is the story that you want to share, taking your story of self to a larger story of us that can be impactful? This was a question I was asking myself because I was trying to figure out my own story of self. Like, I was a fledgling doctor, didn't know what I was doing, following in the footsteps of a murderer, not sure about that. My family was telling me to leave Asheville. They thought I was going to be killed if he ever got out of prison. There was a lot of chaos. My kids were young. They were 1 year old and 3 years old. It was a really chaotic time in my life. That was the story, the only story that I knew at that time. But then as I started to hear more stories about Vince and become more curious, I started to see a different type of story emerge. And then, of course, in my mind, I really, in my heart, I believe that he was not that cold-blooded killer. Nothing pointed towards that. And so we decided, so I enlisted some help from a journalist because I needed to figure out what happened to Vince. And so we did a deep dive for about 6 months. And I went to the prison, I wrote him, and I was really anxious about it. And I got a letter back, and the letter was indecipherable. It was a madman's scrawl. And the last word of the letter was, "Please help." I didn't know what to do. So we did this podcast. And then through the workings of the podcast, we discovered everybody, many people who had known Vince, and they believed too that he was not this person that he was convicted for. And we met our first superhero, who was this amazing psychiatrist in the prison who also believed that Vince was not malingering. And I was still torn between, like, who is Vince? After seeing him, I saw a decrepit man who's only 8 years older than me, who shuffled in to see me, and who had grimacing dyskinesias. His fingers were rolling. He was unstable on his feet. His gait was unstable, and he could barely talk to me. Part of it was that he was scared. The other part was that he had clear cognitive deficits. And when I saw him walk away during that first time I met him, I could see that his gait was a little bit shuffling. It wasn't right. And so at that moment, I thought, oh my gosh, like, he clearly has a psychiatric problem, but he likely has a neurologic problem as well. But still, remember what my bias was. My bias was that he had a traumatic brain injury. And ironically, the month before I went to see Vince, we had Sarah Lee Guthrie, Woody Guthrie's granddaughter, Arlo Guthrie's daughter, played a concert in my backyard. And we spent the whole night talking about Woody Guthrie. And she told me so many things about his life as an artist, as a musician, but also as a Huntington's patient, and what that experience was like for him. So I started to imagine, like, what this story could be, but I didn't know what it would be. But I begged the psychiatrist in the prison, after I snuck in another psychiatrist into the prison to help me determine, was this man, Vince, was he a sociopath or not? Because a lot of people, even the prison guards, still believe that he might be sociopathic, but I didn't believe it. And as we were walking out of the prison on the second time to see Vince, the psychiatrist turned to me and he said, oh my gosh, is it possible that he has Huntington's disease? And then I started reaching deep. Into my brain, because all medical students know what Huntington's disease is. But the only thing we know is the CAG repeat. That's it. We don't know any of the nuances. Most people don't know the nuances of Huntington's disease. Most doctors don't know that Huntington's often starts with more psychiatric symptoms. Most people don't know that psychiatrists like to claim Huntington's disease first, and then the neurologists like to claim it later. So we have a very rudimentary understanding of what Huntington's disease was, and I was just trying to recall the basics of it. But by the time we got to the car, I pulled out my phone and went down the checklist. Check dyskinesias, check. Cognitive deficits, check. Gait instability, check. Irritability, check. He had some of the rare delusions, check. And on down the list, check, 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 check. So we really believed in that moment that he had Huntington's. Trying to get someone tested in prison, very hard. Very, very hard. And at this time, the prison was not very happy with me, because we had this podcast that went out. And in fact, the judge who convicted Vince Gilmer called the governor the very next day and asked him to get the psychiatrist fired. And on Sunday morning, the day after our podcast came out, the head of the Department of Corrections descended on this prison and tried to get the psychiatrist who had been working in the prison for 40 years to get him fired. You all know more than anyone that this disease has many boulders throughout the progression of it, boulder after boulder. These were the first boulders that I was starting to encounter as we began to seek for justice for Vince. So this is sort of the framework that I think about it, kind of the framework of pursuing justice or pursuing advocacy, and you guys are the experts, but curiosity is the first. Like, if we lose curiosity, we lose pretty much everything. No one was curious about Vince in prison. No one was really curious about Vince during his trial. Over this decade-long time that he had been in prison, nobody had second-guessed his malingering diagnosis. So these were some of the things that I became more curious about. Hearing, again, that he was the kindest doctor, his patients had ever known, that he was a good guy, that he did act a little differently that winter, that he gave me a big hug at every visit. I became more and more curious about what happened to him. And then at some point during your journey of curiosity, you have to decide, I'm gonna do a deeper dive inquiry. And that's what we were doing in that moment. We were trying to discover more about him. And we were learning how to explore and question. We were learning how to reflect about Vince Gilmer differently for the first time. I was learning how to be sort of a journalist. I was taking notes from Sarah Koenig. Sarah Koenig is the person who did the Serial podcast, if you listen to that. And she's like a master at this and was teaching me how to be a better pursuant of truth through inquiry. And there is Vince. And he looks very differently now. At this point, he was still a very young man, and he has aged so rapidly in prison. Because as you know, Huntington's is a disease that responds well when you are loved. In prison, there's not much love. There's not much rehabilitation. There's very little treatment, and there's very little compassion. These are the things that I've learned over the last 10 years. So what does inquiry do for you? Well, I was trying to be a student of it, but I was also trying to pivot to teach these things to some of the other people who had been involved, because judgment becomes curiosity when you see it through the lens of like a clinical process of inquiry. Disagreement becomes more of a shared exploration. Defensiveness becomes self-reflection. Assumptions get turned into questions, and then talking turns into listening. So after you learn something, so I was starting to learn a lot. I was learning that I had faith that Vince did not need to be in prison. I was learning that prison is a horrific place for anyone. I was starting to learn that that rehabilitation does not exist. Literally does not exist. But this is what really was the hook for me. Learning that half of the people in prison, so anybody want to guess how many people are in prison today in America? 2 million. Yeah, over 2 million or so. Anybody want to guess how many severely mentally ill patients are in prison today? Half. Yeah. So close to 1 million, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people. Anyone want to guess where the largest mental hospitals are in this country?
South.
In the South? We do have a lot of there's a paucity of mental hospitals, but the three largest institutions that have the majority of mentally ill patients are Rikers Island Prison in New York, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and the LA Jail in Los Angeles. Those are the three. And when you look at the numbers, it's astounding that they're, firstly, the big picture, 25% of the world's incarcerated people are in America. And there are 10 times more mentally ill people in prison than there are in all of the mental hospitals across the country. Imagine that. These were things that I didn't know. I'd never been to a prison before. I was never even been close to one. I'd barely even seen one before. So this was like a big transformation for me. I started to see and wonder as a doctor, why do I not know this? We should know this. And 25% of my patients are psychiatric patients. So then, I started learning a little bit more about Huntington's and a lot more about the diagnosis of Huntington's and the struggle of Huntington's and the fact that, the treatment of Huntington's really takes a whole community. And I was struck by, after having conversations with Woody Guthrie's granddaughter, that so much of the brilliance, and I don't know how many people really think about Woody Guthrie this way, but so much of his brilliance was happening while his Huntington's was evolving. So many of his songs, he wrote thousands. Who's a Woody Guthrie fan out there? Yeah, thank you. He wrote thousands of songs. He was the most prolific songwriter in our history by far. He puts Bob Dylan to shame in terms of number of songs written. Woody Guthrie, during this period of while his Huntington's was blossoming in a way, so was his genius of songwriting, because the brain is changing in ways that make it more permeable, I think, in some ways, to like your right hemisphere of your brain. As you know, there's some disinhibition that happens, and you become more human and real in some ways. And this was part of Woody Guthrie's genius. So then we all get to a point, and this is, I think, where we are today, being in this room. We get to a point where you know something, you've been curious about something, you found it out, you've been moved to do something, but then you don't know how to do it. Or you get to a point where you're starting to reflect on how can we actually make a difference? Like, what can we do? What vision can we have to move or make a change in something? And I was discovering that this process of visioning is such a collaborative one. And so I joined a book club. I joined a book club this year. And it's amazing what happens when you get together with a group and you have an intentional process of trying to vision together. And so I've had a lot of help to try to vision what I could do as a single person to take care of Vince. And out of that vision was writing this book. It was inspired by one of the governors of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, because together we put together with a team of lawyers, we put together a clemency petition to get Vince out of prison. Because if you have a terminal illness, if you have any mental illness, you should not be in prison. In my mind, this is a violation of the 8th Amendment, which is cruel and unusual punishment. And so we set out to get him out. And our first barrier was Terry McAuliffe, a Democrat. And he sat on our clemency petition until the very last day he was in office. And on that very last day, at which point he was considering a bid for the presidency of the United States, until Hillary Clinton told him, no, you can't do that. He denied our petition. This was like I felt like a massive failure. I thought that it would be so easy to advocate and get him out of prison because we had all the data. We had a diagnosis that helped explain some of why Vince's brain was challenged at the time. But it turns out his brain, and part of the curiosity for me in writing this book, was really looking at what happened to his brain. And it wasn't Huntington's. Like, Huntington's was just it was a small part of it. He had been abused by his father for his whole life. He had had PTSD from it. He had had chronic depression for decades. He had had generalized anxiety disorder. He had ADHD. He had a brain that was evolving towards Huntington. So there were many things that were affecting the evolution of his mind. So I want that to be very clear, that Vince Gilmer did not do this because of Huntington's. It was just a small part of his story. But it's one that we know is genetically identifiable. And there aren't many psychiatric illnesses that are genetically identifiable. So this was really helpful for us as we were advocating for his release, because we had proof that there was something contributing to the delusions that he had that night with his father. There were other bad things that were happening that his father was doing to him that night too that were provocative. So we lost. What do you do when you lose? I was demoralized. As a physician, I couldn't believe it. Like, how could this guy say no to this? And I learned that it was because of politics. So, thank you. I'm going to try to wrap this up so we can talk together. And then we had to do it again. So we did a second petition, and this time the stars had aligned because the next governor of Virginia was a neurologist. And we thought, how could this be? How could a neurologist have landed as the governor of Virginia? We thought literally like a miracle had happened. And that miracle led to 2 more years of waiting, and then another 2 more or 18 months of waiting. And then he rejected our clemency petition. And I was devastated. And at this point, I had decided I'm going to write this book, no matter what happens, to explain and advocate for Vince. And I got the first release of the book before it was sold, and I dumped it in the governor's office. And somebody read it, because a few weeks later, during his last day in office, he reversed his clemency rejection and pardoned Vince. So maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A, but again, the story of now is this. What is the urgent challenge that each of us face? So this is just my story. We all have a story of now, and that story of now is intertwined with having partners like HD Reach, and thinking about what does it take to get your story of self into a story of now, and then to convert it into a story of us. So for me, it was trying to write. I had never written a book before. This was like a brand new experience. I didn't know anything. I got a C- at Davidson in English Comp. But I worked really hard because I was so motivated to write this story for Vince. And then it just dragged on. And maybe we can talk later throughout the day about, telling uncomfortable stories is hard. And this was very hard for me, and it's hard in this community to talk about the very uncomfortable story that many of you live with. So I was trying to pursue ways to attach Vince's story to the media. So we have People Magazine and New York Times, Washington Post, and I wanted Vince's message to get out there. And ultimately it did. But he is still in prison today, and I was really hoping, I was praying that he would be able to come today to be a part of this. Next year, for sure, he's going to come. It's important for him to know you. And part of the message that the Vince's story brings, and what I'm trying to bring to this dilemma, is this notion of reverence for life. Reverence for life is a philosophy that Albert Schweitzer proposed, who was a mentor of mine in Africa, posthumously. But it's a story that I think everybody can identify with, that if you see someone struggling in this fight for survival, you just have to help. So that is what this is all about. Why don't we stop right there? Because I really want to hear your questions if you have any. Story of us, story of now. Story of HD redemption.
What's the holdup of the release?
So the holdup of the release is that we don't have enough resources to take care of our mentally ill people in this country, in North Carolina. So if you have a felony and you have a complicated psychiatric illness, it's so hard to get in anywhere. So we've been battling to get Vince into a hospital, which is part of the clemency, for 14 months now. And we've had rejection after rejection after rejection. Yeah. It's the horrible truth about mental illness in America, is that we just don't take care of our people.
I know back at the table that we have options, little cards and envelopes to be able to send him some encouraging letters, words, notes. What do you feel would be great messages that he would like to hear from us?
Thank you for asking that. We are hoping to get him out in this next month. If the VA system, if our government, who's trying to step up for him right now, will make this happen for him, if you wanted to write him a note, it would be beautiful. Like, he would be so touched. So what I'm going to do is I'll write his address out on the table, but if you go to my website at benjamingilmer.com, I've got some bookmarks that have my website on it. On the website, I'm going to list his mailing address. So if you want to mail him something, he would be so touched. Yeah. In the back. Yes, ma'am.
I grew up around a lot of dementia. So I'm very sympathetic to it. But I could see why people would be reluctant to let somebody out of prison who would kill somebody for fear of hurting other people. My mother was severely demented, had severe dementia. And, she was never imprisoned or anything like that. And my brother worked for I don't know, it seems like to me the correct term they called it was the criminally insane. So anyway, I would guess how would, I'm very, very into this, and I would like to advocate for this, but how would you ease those concerns of safety for society, by letting somebody out who's, has been known to hurt people?
So that's a good question. This is a question that a lot of people ask. Like, how do we maintain accountability? For me, it's totally different because I see, and what I'm trying to propose, and sort of the thesis is in the book, is that we can heal crime, and that it's not fair to look at each individual and define their life by the worst thing that they've done. And so for Vince, he did this bad thing, and there are like 10 reasons why it happens. And since that time, he's never done anything else. That was his only infraction throughout his whole life. And so I think the other part of this story is that all of us are cognitively vulnerable. We're cognitively fallible during our life. And the larger question is how do we develop empathy for that? Like, we try to do that as physicians. We try to see all of our patients as like a tabula rasa without preconception. And this is hard because we have this notion of what punishment is in our country, and like our history is built on punishing people in some ways. Like it's deeply tied to our history. And so we have this internal bias or commitment that we've just all grown up with in this country about the need to punish others. And I think a lot of people with mental illness are punished because if you don't have mental illness, it's hard to understand that person. You become fearful of it. If you don't have Huntington's, it's hard to understand like what it is. You become fearful of it. And so there's so much fear that's wrapped into this, which makes it hard to forgive. And so that was sort of the big point, is like, well, if we can develop, see him clinically through compassionate eyes, I think it changes everything.
So my question is, where is he going to be able to go? Because clearly you can just like send him home. Have you found a facility for him? And also, like, again, since I'm not sure he has any family left. Like, he's never bring them, and you probably have to make up a lot of the, not make up, but a lot of the stuff that happened in prison, the isolation and all of that. So is he going to be provided with some sort of,
So everyone who is incarcerated in America has been living in isolation since COVID. So Vince really doesn't have family left. And so I became his guardian. So he has to be moved into a clinical setting, but that could be anything. The most appropriate place initially would be a hospital that can really evaluate him, treat him, stabilize his transition, and then ultimately he'll be in a skilled nursing facility. That was the only thing that the governor asked, is that he be in a clinical setting for the rest of his life.
I just have a plug. My wife Jennifer found this site called storyworth.com.
Yeah.
And she was able to, in several chapters, write the story of her life and her childhood.
Beautiful.
And they print the books for you. And so
Beautiful.
she sent them to our 7 blended children family and her dad. And it meant a lot to her and also to our children and family.
Yay. That sounds like a great model. I'm sure your family will cherish that forever.
Oh, I just had a quick question. Did you find out like whether his like father or mother had Huntington's? Like which one?
So his father had Huntington's. So he was misdiagnosed. He was misdiagnosed as having schizophrenia. And so, obviously if he had been diagnosed, then Vince would have been diagnosed, none of this would have ever happened. So hence the importance of having the tools to know. Yeah, that part is really tragic. And his sister likely also had Huntington's too. She went missing and has never been found. Yeah.
How much awareness does he have of his diagnosis? And as a physician, how much acceptance does he have of his diagnosis?
Yeah, this is a beautiful thing. Like the diagnosis for Vince was a gift because it enabled him, like really in the first time in his life, to make sense of it. So he started to understand. Oh wow, this is why I was feeling this way back in medical school. This is why the divorce was so hard for me. This is why I've been hearing these voices. This is why I have these shakes in my hands. Like he's been so grateful, like to have the diagnosis, because it's also helped everyone understand who he is and exonerates him. It's been helpful for his family. It's been helpful for everyone around him. So he's the happiest person on the planet to have received this diagnosis.
So one more question I have is, so you said the first study that talked about like the cerebral scrap and the helping at the end, that he needed help. Has he since then been able, since you have established trust and all of that, are you actually able to communicate in some way, shape, or form, or how is that working?
Oh yes, I mean my family, we've been going to the prison for 10 years, and so I go to the prison all the time, and he's like a brother. So communication, he communicates well. He's just it takes a little time to process, but he communicates well and expresses joy at times and laughter. I'm just so excited to see what he becomes after prison, to see how much better his symptoms. He's never been treated other than an SSRI. So to see what a loving environment will do to him is going to be so, so beautiful.
I think we have time for one more.
Hi, so first of all, just thank you for what you did for Vince and continue to do, and for sharing the story. Amazing. I had two quick questions. One was, what is your sort of hypothesis, or what do you think happened the second time you petitioned for clemency with the governor, who was actually a neurologist? Why do you think that took so long? And then my follow-on would be, in terms of the struggle that you've been facing in terms of getting him placed since the pardon, do you think that has to do specifically with his story and the fact that, despite his pardon, that he committed this crime earlier? Or is that more of a general symptom that just getting anyone from the prison symptom into a clinical facility, is pretty much impossible? Like, how much of it is his situation factoring into that, do you think?
There are some situational aspects of it, for sure. But any inmate or person who has been incarcerated trying to transition with a specific plan. So Vince had a determined specific plan because of the clemency. And that is, to cross state lines is very hard, because you can't get into a public psychiatric facility until you've been a resident for a period of time. So none of the public hospitals in North Carolina will step up to take care of him. He has to land in Buncombe County first before we can even do an application. So that's like a big part. There aren't that many places where a patient like Vince can go. Virginia said no. They closed all their doors to Vince. And part of that was some vengefulness, I think. Part of it was that they just wanted to get him out of the state. And so there's that element of it too, but it's just really hard because our resources are so difficult. Trying to get into the Black Mountain Neurobehavioral Center, where we have, which is a beautiful place, which has a long history of taking care of Huntington's patient. 2-year waiting list. Broughton Hospital could take a year. Cherry Hospital the same. Butner the same. So it's our system is so barraged and overwhelmed right now that it's hard to gain access. What happened with Governor Northam, I think, he was feeling a little bit liberated on his last day in office, and we learned how to play the game. We hounded him. I dumped 30 books into the governor's office and was just calling people incessantly, talking to senators. That's the work that has to happen.
I know that was supposed to be the last question, but is there anything we can do to help this?
Well, when we get him back to North Carolina, then HD Reach will be very important. Yeah, for sure.
But in terms of helping to get him here.
I think right now it's in the office of the general counsel for the VA, the federal office. So I think we're going to be. I think we're going to be good. If that doesn't work out, then I'm going to be calling all of you, every single one. If you have a special place in mind that you know of, please send it to my website. You can email me through the website, and hopefully. And I've been using HD Reach as an example of why he needs to come back to North Carolina, because we have such a beautiful community of HD and supporters and social workers and physicians. That this is like the perfect state to return to in so many ways. Yeah. Thank you for writing and listening and for inviting me today.
Let's give Dr. Gilmer another round of applause.